Hello! Hello,
Hello.
everyone, and welcome to another Ubuntu On Air episode with me. My name is Reese, and Monica.
Hello. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Good. It was great to see my family, but kind of nice not to be doing these things super early.
From the
There was
States? From California? You're
from
always in the States.
California. Yes. So, but yeah, those 5 a.m. ones were brutal. So it's good to be back.
I bet. And
Yeah.
back at a slightly earlier time than normal, right? So while Hey, Heather. So while things are going on, while people are turning up, we'll just explain that a little bit. So at the moment, we're moving the APAC ones that we've normally been doing, which have been pretty early for the Americas, also midday in the UK. We're moving those to only go and correspond with the Desktop Dabbers, which happen on the last Friday of every month. And then every other one we've moved to this time so that it's a little bit earlier for UK people and a little bit earlier for the Americas as well, but this way we can get everyone and not have to have people struggling to stay awake.
Yeah, I always kind of felt bad because it was at like 7, 8 p.m. for all of you. And I'm like, well, that's not fair. Your work day's done. And it's like, haha, come back. So
come back, do some more. Yeah, exactly. So before we introduce our guests and talk about other things, why don't we update people on things that have been going on in the community? Do you have anything to share?
Well, you have 1 week to get in your submissions for the desktop wallpaper contest. So
1 week?
1 week. I know this. It's because the 13th is tomorrow and it closes on the 20th. So yeah, August is flying by. It's a bit terrifying. So if you have not gotten in your photograph or original artwork to the desktop wallpaper competition, you still have time, but not much. So
not time. Is there any that you've noticed? Have there been any macaroni art yet?
Not that I've noticed yet, but I've got a box of macaroni in my pantry taunting me, saying, "Make artwork."
Good. Well, as long as it's in your pantry, you should keep it there. That could be a demon. Yep. What else has been going on? Have you seen the new and interesting and wonderful KDE adverts that have been going out? There's been 2 now, I think.
I just saw them pop across my Twitter this morning, so that's very exciting.
Aren't they cool? Don't they look cool?
Mm-hmm.
Did you?
I know.
So apparently the video footage they've been using is just stock video footage from Pixels, and the voiceover is done by just some voiceover folks from Fiverr. So it's all super easily done. It wasn't professionally. Well, I guess it was professionally done, but it wasn't. And I learned this on my other piece of news. I learned this at the Ubuntu podcast when I was talking where I appeared this week.
Well, you can listen to it right now. Put the link to your episode. I mean, don't listen to it right now because you should watch our show, but listen to it afterwards if you want to keep hearing Reese. And so you were filling in for Wimpy, right?
I was filling in for Martin, who was off frolicking on holiday somewhere.
Of course,
I filled in for him, and I will put a link somewhere, but I'll put it in the description so people watching live and don't get distracted right now. Oh, excellent. There it is. Thanks, Yannick. Nice. So, awesome. So without further ado, we're getting some people come in now. When we introduce our guest, I'll go ahead and do a little tweet from the Ubuntu account to see if we can get some more people coming in. But Monica, do you want to introduce our guest for this afternoon?
Our guest is our new director of documentation, and we are very happy to have him on. He is a longtime contributor to open source, notably with the Python and Django communities. And so welcome, Daniele Projects. I hope I got your last name right.
Thank you, Monica and Reese. Hi, folks. Nice to be here with you.
Well, thank you for coming, and especially since you've been at Canonical for just about a month or so now.
A
month or 2?
5 weeks and 4 days. I've been counting.
Well, we're very happy to have you on, and I know that we've both been going to the workshops that you've been having. It's been extremely enjoyable, especially for those of us who have had a bit of experience with documentation, but haven't gotten too far into like the theoretical weeds. So it's been really great.
Well, I've suddenly felt I felt that I've jumped in right at the deep end and to be paddling straight away.
That's the best way to go, honestly. So tell us about where did your journey in open source start, and how did it get started?
Yeah. I think probably the experience I had is similar to the experience that many people had, is in that I found myself with a problem, and the only way to solve it was going to be to create some software to solve it. And that was 12 or so years ago. Mm-hmm. And when you're in that position, then inevitably you will find not just open source software, but that open source software communities tend to be the most powerful ways to get the help you want.
What was that first project? What was that first open source thing that you were interested in?
It was a web content management system.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so,
and you took it off from there. Where did you go next? What was your journey to Django, I believe?
No, that kept me busy for quite a long time. That was a Python Django-based web content management system. At the time, I was working at Cardiff University School of Medicine in Wales, in the UK. And developing and maintaining this system kept me busy for several years. And during that time, I became a participant as well in the same community that had helped me so much at the beginning. So I was a very regular person on Python and Django IRC channels, asking the same questions over and over again until I finally understood them.
That's something that we've talked to a couple of people now about how they've gotten started in open source in that way, and that's something that comes up very, very nicely. Is that people participate, they ask for help, they ask questions, and then down the road they sort of fit back into that and they give back to that community in that way.
Yeah, it's very much that feeling of reciprocity going forward, and kind of that, that having been the one being helped, then once we're able to be the one who can help, there's that really strong I want to say push, but it's not. It's more this internal input it has to do that. And I think that makes for some of the best participation, honestly.
Definitely. I've got a little, I don't know, this might be interesting from, if you think back to 2009, this is Ubuntu related, that I wasn't actually using Ubuntu. I had to manage a Debian-based virtual server. But what I discovered was that if I was doing a web search for any technical question related to this server, I'd often find very impenetrable, difficult answers to the things I was trying to look for. But if I added the search Ubuntu to my search term, it would change the quality of the kind of stuff that came up in my search results. And I'd find friendlier stuff written from a different perspective, not necessarily coming out of the Ubuntu community, but from people writing about it, just because there was something about Ubuntu that encouraged people to write and communicate in certain ways.
That's really interesting. I don't think I've heard. I've heard that one before.
Yeah, and nowadays I use Raspberry Pi in my search queries, and it's really noticeable. So I can recommend that. Yeah.
Yeah, I recommend putting Ubuntu in the search engine. I think I can recommend that as well. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really interesting, kind of having that different kind of either like documentation, like tone or quality based on the different communities. And knowing that in 2009 that was us, and now it's with the Raspberry Pi.
I think the crucial thing there though is it's the active outward looking communities, right? A lot of what we're doing at the moment is sort of inward looking. We're trying to make sure that members of the community are doing okay and enabling them to do things, and soon, hopefully soon, we'll be looking to look more externally and get those things. But the Raspberry Pi folks are still in that active phase of going outwards, and this is hopefully maybe this will relate to what we'll talk about later. But I'm not sure if you've seen their new documentation sort of portal that they've got going on, which is very clean looking. What do you think of that?
Yeah. That I think it popped up came to my attention a day or two ago, and I'm not sure what they're building it on, but it's very encouraging that people are thinking about documentation in such systematic ways, as not just as information about a product, but as something that kind of seals together a whole ecosystem or community of understanding and knowledge and practice around some particular product.
Maybe that's so. I think one of the folks, I'm not sure if they were leading it, if they were just part of it, but one of the folks that I know over there called Alistair was a part of this. And I wonder if maybe in the future we can start having conversations with them about blurring the lines between the other operating systems parts of their documentation and our Raspberry Pi parts of the documentation, and see if there's a little bit of middle ground where we can sort of mold together, because it's just a very pretty little website they've got there at the moment.
Yeah. No.
Anyway, so you spent a long time on the Debian servers, and you searched Ubuntu and so on. So how did you get from just putting Ubuntu in there to get a good result to using Ubuntu, or moving along to get your documentation instincts?
Actually, documentation came for me at the same time as software, because I wasn't a programmer when I started doing this stuff. I had to become a programmer in order to solve the problems that I wanted to solve. And not being a programmer meant that I was acutely conscious of where documentation and the information and guides and tutorials I wanted were lacking. And it became a very obvious and easy way to put something back. That, for example, if I had understood something and was able to repeat it back to somebody else in a way that made sense, then this was an easy thing to put into somebody's documentation. And that's what I started doing. I quite enjoy doing that. Also for my own sake, because that process of taking something in and then repeating it to someone else is the best way of ensuring that you have understood it. So it was very self-interested too. And that's how I became increasingly involved. That's how my first contributions to open source software came about, through documentation. I wasn't really in a position to make substantial contributions to, say, the internals of Django, but I could definitely make a meaningful contribution, even as a beginner, to its documentation. That's
something that's really interesting and good to hear, because we've had a few people say they got their start on sites like Ask Ubuntu and the forums and so on. And a couple of times in various places, Monica and I have been talking about how documentation is, of course, a way to contribute to open source. And I don't think it's something that we've seen a tremendous amount of examples on. So for someone to say that it's where they started and has also made a career out of it is pretty great.
Yeah. There might be, do we want to take questions as they come, or save them towards the end?
Yeah, I think we can take questions as they come.
Because I think that there's one here that would be really good, and it kind of builds off of this conversation. And Daniele, sorry we cut your face off for a second.
Oh, no, that's terrible.
But a point that emerged in Guadex 21's presentation was that documentation is also outreach, that each user's query is an opportunity to convert that user into a contributor. Wise or unwise?
And you want an answer from me. You want an answer.
Yes, we absolutely
Your
want an answer
thought.
from
I
you.
mean, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, or
I don't know
thoughts.
I don't know if I have an answer to that. I think that's a really interesting. I mean, every part of that question from Ian is interesting. Okay, so the documentation is also outreach. I think that the relationship between software and community, the relation between those two, it's not only documentation, but documentation is inextricable from that relationship. That documentation is the way the creators or the maintainers of some software communicate and speak to their users. You know, if you've, especially when you're starting out learning to become skilled in some software, you spend an awful lot of time in that documentation, and it's like being with people. It's like being in a culture or being with different people's personalities, and you get a very good sense of whether, for example, the people who wrote this documentation like their users. You can read some documentation and you get a sense that actually I feel a bit like the person writing this documentation might have regarded me as a bit of a nuisance or something that had to be dealt with. And I spent a lot of time in the Django documentation and felt, okay, these people, somebody out there wants to help me. They don't know who I am, but you pick this up. And because the documentation can be quite responsive, which is the second part of this question from Ian, you really start to get a sense of how the documentation can knit together those relationships with the community. And I think it's tremendously important. And when something does it right, the benefits are huge in general.
And when you say do it right, that sounds to me like a sort of like a tonal, a style thing. You know, it's not necessarily who's writing the documentation, but how they're writing it. Is that something that that you encourage in people contributing or writing documentation, is thinking about the style in which they write?
I think so. And, you know, different documentation and different products, they've got their own style guides and so on. But documentation that puts itself in the shoes of the reader, of the user, is expressing a kind of, let's call it empathy or sympathy for the user. And you can tell when people have been making efforts to try and see something, for example, from the perspective of somebody who's trying to troubleshoot a problem, or somebody who's learning something from first principles. And people don't always recognize that very explicitly, but they get a good feeling. They sense what's going on.
Go ahead, Monica. Go ahead.
Yeah, just as someone who also came out of an academic background, the constant kind of encouragement we got to write reader-centered prose. And just because I think that it's sometimes a little bit easy to forget that there is going to be that user that, you know, and if we write it, you know, towards making not only towards making whatever process we're trying to illustrate or explain clear, but make it known that their curiosity and their desire for help is welcome. That, you know, and they feel not only educated but kind of encouraged. I think that's a really good point.
There's, of course, the other end of the spectrum of that comment, though, right? Of documentation is also outreach. Can it be used to convert users into contributors? There's the other end of that spectrum, which is almost bordering on, well, that's turns into marketing and things like trying to bring people in. And I wonder how much of a place you think that kind of stuff has in documentation, if that should be completely separate.
And actually, thank you, because I wanted to go back to that second part of Ian's question about, each user's documentation query is an opportunity to convert that user into a contributor. Is that wise or unwise? Well, I think there's always going to be a ratio of contributors to consumers. There are always going to be more of the latter. I don't think you can turn every user into a contributor. They might not have the skills, they might not have the time. And also, there is quite a lot of investment required on the part of somebody to become a good contributor to documentation or software. They've got to learn certain skills and so on. Not everybody's going to be good at it. So I don't think it's really something that we could hope for, to turn every single user into a contributor. Still, we can make sure that we turn each user into an advocate on behalf of our product, or a more advanced user on behalf of our product. What we can certainly do is turn every documentation query into a test for our documentation. If you get the same query over and over again, or you realize that the same confusion is being expressed by users over and over again, that's a really good sign that you might want to have a look at your documentation there.
Definitely. Tracking, it's famously in sort of tech industry is that tracking, if you're not measuring something, then it's not really existing, right? And so how are you going to improve documentation unless you're measuring these different things? What for measuring something like that? Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say measure. Yeah, yes. On the other hand, I was also going to say that so many of this kind of feedback is actually very hard to quantify. So I've had, before I was at Canonical, we had the experience when I was working at Devio, where we had a Docker-based cloud management product that, in a conversation in the team, somebody remarked, isn't it funny how some of the questions that are now coming to technical support, how difficult those questions are getting? And then everyone said, yes, the questions are becoming more and more challenging. People are pushing the boundaries of the product now. They're doing things that we weren't expecting them to. How was that happening? I think it was happening because our documentation was soaking up all those earlier questions, and now people were standing on something where they had a lot of confidence in, and they were starting to go in directions we hadn't anticipated. They were thinking up use cases that were new to us. They weren't having to spend their energy on that more basic stuff, and neither were we, because we dealt with it in documentation. We just stopped seeing that stuff in technical support. And instead, the questions were getting more and more difficult. We're thinking, my God, why? Who's going to answer this one? And we would be forced to invent new stuff. And that's a really good sign that your documentation is doing its work. And that's really hard to get metrics for. That's just a kind of noticing that the character of something has changed. And that was a very interesting experience to have.
That's a very interesting. I think that's almost an ideal situation, right? Your documentation is successful if people are using it so well and enough that they're looking for things that there isn't documentation for.
Yeah, I think so.
Very cool. So with that in mind, though, are there things that you think, if people are doing documentation sets of their own, are there easy things that you think people should be measuring or could be measuring to improve that kind of thing? And this is a bit of a sprung question, I know. But
yeah, if let's say your project is of a certain size. Let's say that it's you've got an IRC channel and beginners are asking the same questions over and over again. That's kind of obvious that you've got a problem there. Or it might be that you realize that your introductory tutorials are taking people up to a certain point, and then suddenly leaving them to fend for themselves when actually they need a little bit more direction. Those are the kinds of things that you can pick up. A a good one to watch out for is people repeatedly in their actual work, for example, committing security errors. That, if everybody using your web framework seems to be exposing the fact that they've come up with some unsafe configuration of a web server or gateway or an authentication system, then you think, well, okay, we're not guiding people properly here.
Just pay attention to what's being asked, right? And then you can figure out what you're missing.
Yeah, and that's and I think that's an interesting thing for us, because I know that we probably have a lot of similar questions that come up, and seeing that as a as a reference tool for where the documentation can be stronger. I think that, instead of seeing it as, why are people asking the same questions? It's like, well, they need kind of more of a framework here. So I think that it turns it into a source of frustration into, oh, hey, this is really valuable information we can use to guide and to guide us and find the gaps in our documentation.
Yeah. It's really important because, look, you might have 1,000 users, and if 150 of them fail to get past the first hurdle, not all 150 are going to tell you about it.
Yeah.
Maybe 120 of those 150 will simply disappear and you'll never hear from them again. So somebody who's put in the effort, for example, to frame a question to you, is somebody who's already climbed over a little bit of a barrier just to ask that question.
It's intent, right? That's value in that, because people, they care enough to ask that question, and so you better pay attention to it.
Don't waste that resource. It's being provided for free. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point, that if people care, if there's intention, people will ask questions, and there's usually good questions. And we've spoken a little bit before. I'm going to try and move back onto your sort of journey in open source and documentation things now. We spoke a little bit about how previously you've been a community member first, and then you became part of that project. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you came to Canonical and what your thinking is at the moment around Ubuntu and documentation.
I arrived here just 6 or so weeks ago, and
welcome.
When I was considering my options, as I say earlier this year, I spoke to a lot of companies in the industry, mostly with open source products, because that's what I do like, what I find interesting. And they all had very strong desires to improve their documentation. When I was talking to Canonical, what I heard was that the ambition is for Canonical to have the best documentation in the industry. And I thought, okay, well, challenge. And I like that was so, nobody else said anything quite as simple as that. It was all, we want you to help improve this, help work on this team, redevelop that. No, this is an opportunity to do something transformative with the ambition of creating something that will stand as an exemplar for an entire industry. And you don't get many offers like that.
Yeah.
So that is why I'm here, and that is what I also hope I'm going to do for Canonical, for the community of Canonical product users, for the Ubuntu community. And of course, the effects of that will ripple out throughout open source software.
Well, that's asking someone to create the best documentation in the industry for Canonical is a different ask to is a different and maybe smaller ask than asking someone to make the best documentation in the industry for Ubuntu. Ubuntu obviously being considerably wider and so on. We like to say that Canonical's a contributor to Ubuntu, whereas Ubuntu is the overarching larger project. But is that something that that you're tackling as well, that you're thinking about? Is yeah,
absolutely, yes. And I think everyone who uses anything in the Ubuntu ecosystem, which encompasses a vast variety of products at different levels, should see the benefits of these efforts over the coming months and years.
Yeah, there's actually, I think that there's some questions we have from the community members in the chat that I think would be kind of useful for this part of the conversation. And the first one was from Ian, and I'm sorry we keep on cutting you off here, but I watched I watched Daniele's video on always complete, never finish a couple days ago. Inspiring. Are there elements of that concept that are applicable to the communities, not canonical documentation?
Yes, I think so. I think that applies to that's about a way of working with documentation. It doesn't have to be for a particular product or organization. You can do it in your own I do it in my own private documentation. It's a way of working that allows you to be comfortable with developing small things at a time in your documentation, to be satisfied that every step represents a step in the right direction, that you're working on a kind of model of well-formed organic growth, that you don't have to have big plans that are executed and completed in order for your work to be valuable. And it's because documentation is about something. This documentation is about the thing that it documents. Whereas software is not about something. The software just is itself. So that changes its nature and changes the way we can work on it. So thank you for Ian for watching that talk. I think that if you've tidied up a really messy child's bedroom, you'll probably have used some of the same principles there, which is that you pick up whatever is in front of you and put it where it belongs. And then you find yourself standing in a different place. You pick up the next thing and put it where it belongs. And then bit by bit, you've found that you've established order, that order has emerged from your work. You didn't go there with a plan. You had an ambition to make the room tidy, but you just have to dive in and just pick up one small thing at a time and be comfortable with doing that. So I think it does. I use it all the time.
I think it's a really interesting methodology. It's a really interesting take on something that I've heard before, which is the sort of I've heard it phrased as marginal gains in the past, where in the industries, in the tech industry, but also most prominently, I suppose, in the aviation industry, where you take very small steps and you test, and you take very small things and then you look at it and you take very small steps. And there's an interesting parallel there, just a little bit different between big old jet planes in a child's bedroom, but it's a nice way of talking about it. Monica, were you going to say something?
Oh, no, I was just saying that for any of us who've ever, had to deal with housework, then I think that always complete but never finished is such a good way of thinking about it, because you clean up the child's room or you clean up your room. It's not done. It's like, it's always, and I like seeing that documentation as process and as verb, rather than as this, it's like you finish it and that's it. And
that's a really good point. I think that, documentation, well, it is the stuff that we produce, but it is also the activity of documenting. Just like communication is the activity of communicating, information is the activity of informing. And we tend to forget the activity part of it and think about the end result. Here's the documentation. Oh, it's done now. Well, if you clean your house, it doesn't matter how scrupulously you clean it. It's not going to stay clean. Just more dust appears from out of wherever dust comes from, and you'll have to clean it again next week.
Yes, exactly. I think it resonates well in open source as a principle because of things like the ideas of release early, release often kind of things, right? It's a similar idea. Even if something isn't finished, as long as you've got something that's complete, you should get it out there and try it out and test things out. And it's yeah. Cool. So moving on. So that's how you came to Canonical. I guess the next two things I wanted to ask are sort of in the short term and the long term. First of all, what are you interested in now? What is your focus of things? Obviously, like you say, you've been here 6 weeks. So I don't expect you to have all of the answers and so on. But what is your focus now? And then Ian's question from before was: is there a vision for what Ubuntu documentation should look like in, say, 5 years?
Okay.
What do you think?
5 years is a very long time. Right now, what I'm working on is very concrete things, because I think that one of the things that I'd like to do is to transform practices and the culture. And you can try and do that by coming in with a plan to transform the practices and the culture and bring it in from on top. And you might get it to work or you might not. But most of those things, I believe, work better when they emerge from concrete actions. So what we're working on now is exemplar projects. We're starting projects where people can see very concretely, as quickly as possible, what it looks like for documentation to improve. And maybe it won't be exactly what it will eventually become, but we should see it moving in that direction all the time. So I'm working with different teams in Ubuntu and at Canonical, choosing various projects, and we're going to use those, and they will become the examples. Look, this is the form that the documentation can have. This is the kind of quality of content we can be aiming for. And with concrete actions, people gain experience. They get an idea of what it is actually to do things in that way. Users get the taste of it because the users feel that something has changed. So ultimately, the goal is a transformation of culture that puts documentation right at the heart of software engineering, which is where I think it belongs. Mm-hmm. But I'd rather get there by working at the low level on individual pieces of documentation and allowing the vision and the understanding of that to emerge, rather than thinking that the way of doing that is by being a visionary leader or something like that. So I think we'll get there better by just doing the pedaling.
Sort of like picking up the small projects from the small child's bedroom floor, right?
Yes, I think so. I think I believe in concrete things, concrete and particular things. And
then going into the future, assuming we have these exemplar projects and so on, have you got a longer term idea?
I think that, as I say, the way engineering cultures work around documentation should be changed. But I think the documentation itself, the actual output, the stuff that we produce, should be extremely consistent. So people always have this understanding of what they're looking at, what this thing is trying to give them, if it's not what they want, where they should find it. And when you're in a system that's well designed, it keeps giving you clues and reassurance that you're in the right place, or if you're not in the right place, where the right place is. And that might be a building, and the architecture of a building that gives you good clues about where you are, that you know what you're going to find around the next corner. And people build up their mental models. And I would like to build towards an entire ecosystem where people's expectations are not confounded. where people can have actually high expectations of what they're going to get and where they're going to find it, and have them fulfilled.
As a built-in structure into the documentation where people can come and they'll know what they're going to do without having to ask the question. So not even needing to ask the questions about the project, about what they're looking for, but not even have to ask questions about where to look.
For example, yes. And what they find then, of course, also should be of the highest quality, so that when you're looking for reference material, you won't find it out-of-date material. You can rely on it being what you needed right now. When you're looking for a guide to achieve some fairly typical task, you can be sure that somebody has thought of it and has provided it. That the beginner who's coming in is going to enter on to a pathway that's reliable and safe, and gives them, that teaches them something and puts them in the position to go further. Not that somebody starts doing a tutorial and finds out that they needed to have some mountain of software installed beforehand, or that there were all these things that they didn't know about they suddenly find they need to do, or there are these gaps in it that they've got to guess or hurdle over. So in every single way that you can think of documentation being better, I think that this wants to become part of the practice of documentation in the entire ecosystem.
Part of the practice in the ecosystem. That's interesting. In your opinion, then, do you have any examples of something that maybe isn't the best in the industry, because that's what we're going to beat? But have you got any examples of documentation that you know out there that does very, very well at this already?
Yeah, I mean, okay, let me not mention things that I'm responsible for, since that was
that would be a little bit. That'll be a little bit of a.
Django's documentation is a good example. Django's documentation is very far from perfect,
sure,
but it's still very good, and you get that sense of the care that has been put into it and the care about the reader. And Django is very well recognized. Gatsby.js, I don't know if anyone uses, these are both web related documentation. That's where I've mostly done my work. I think they are consistently good. And then if you want some things that are more specific, for example, in the Django world, there is the Django Girls tutorial, which I know many people. Django Girls is an organization that puts on workshops for women to get a start in programming through Django. And they wrote a very comprehensive tutorial from scratch that has now been road tested by literally thousands of people. And it takes an approach that is very unlike the approaches you find in most software tutorials, in the lack of assumptions it makes, for example, and the tone it takes. And I think that's a super example of how a tutorial can work.
Yeah, and it's and this is having, coming from having done your workshops, but talking about, kind of how you make the splits in your diataxis model between tutorials and how-to guides, because I think in a lot of communities there's a bit of conflation between the two, and I think that's where some of those assumptions about skill sets that people have might come from. And so can you talk us through kind of talk about diataxis in less than 15 minutes.
Okay. I'll do it in a lot less than that. So diataxis is the documentation authoring framework that I've developed over the last few years. And it identifies structure within documentation as one of the biggest problems that authors of documentation and users of documentation have to face. So you'll often see documentation divided up in different ways. Sometimes it will be by different topic or different parts of the system. Sometimes it will be divided into how-to guides and reference and so on. And what the diataxis structure does is put user needs right at the heart of documentation, so that you're always asking, what user need is this trying to serve? And sometimes users need practical guidance. They're trying to do something, or your documentation is telling them to do something. So that would be an example. In a tutorial, you guide somebody by taking them through the steps they need to do. That's for a beginner. In a how-to guide, which could be used by an experienced user, you give them the steps they need to do. You're not telling them the steps in a basic way, but you're saying to them things that are much more at a much higher level. If you want to configure your web server for HTTPS, then you need to do such and such, and these are the steps. That's not a tutorial, but it's still practical. The tutorial would be, now you have to go into your terminal and type this command. Now you have to open your file and edit this part of it. Other stuff is theoretical. Reference material is theoretical. It's not telling you to do anything. It's just giving you information about the machinery. And explanation. Why do we use HTTPS rather than HTTP? That's not telling you what to do. It's just telling you why we do it. Or maybe it tells you about the history of HTTP vulnerabilities. So we've got distinction between practical things and technical information. But we can also make a distinction between what we need when we are acquiring our skills and when we're putting them into practice when we're working. Mm-hmm. So when I am learning, when I'm doing a tutorial, I'm doing something practical and I'm gaining skills. But the how-to guide, although it's practical, is about how do I put this skill into practice right now? I'm not following your lesson. I'm now doing something for myself, but I need your guidance to remind me what steps I need to take. Then when I'm working, I might need some reference. I might need to look at what the signature of some method is. And that will be the reference. I need that when I'm working. What's the signature of this method? I'll go and look it up in the documentation. And that's theoretical information that I can apply to my work. And then finally, we've got explanation, which is there to help me deepen my understanding. And it's building up my knowledge. I'm not using it. If I ask the question, why is it better to use HTTPS? That's not a question I ask while I'm working. That's a question I use when I'm acquiring knowledge. So we have these two axes of the theoretical and the practical, and acquisition and application of skill and knowledge. And they give us tutorials, how-to guides, reference, and explanation. And this describes everything that somebody needs in the way of documentation. When the documentation is about some skill, like using software, it's the full map, because it's like the compass. It's got two axes and your four directions. So I think I see that the website address for diataxis has been shared. I would suggest to have a quick look at that. It was less than 15 minutes, wasn't it?
Much less than 15 minutes. I think that was about 4. Great.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say,
okay.
Sorry, but
go ahead.
There were some questions. Do you mind if I pick out
Not
one of
at all.
these?
Actually, that's what I was going to say. We've still got some questions to answer.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a question here from French guy CH, which I think is probably not your given name, but thank you for the question. I think this is a really good question. I'm often told that whoever created a thing is the best person to write the documentation about it. And I don't think so. I think the best person to write documentation about it is the person who's just learnt to use it. The person who's created it is the best person to ask. when you're writing the documentation. But they now have such a high-level view of it. They'll give you really good answers, but they're not in the best position now to explain it to a beginner. Because, first of all, they'll try to explain it, and the beginner doesn't need an explanation. The beginner needs to be led to achieve some success with it. They don't want an explanation right now. They said, show me how to do something with this. Show me how I can do something meaningful and interesting with it. And the person who will understand that need best is the person who's just acquired their first success themselves and now wants to share it. That's actually how I got into documentation myself. This understanding something and then immediately wanting to put something in.
Yeah, to give back. It's another sort of parallel to something that that is quite common and I've viewed before in tech things, which is that the person who understands a problem the most is the person who wrestles with it, the person who's currently dealing with it. The person who's created a thing has completed it. Even though things might not be finished, they've completed it. And so they have this higher level view, whereas the people that are who are dealing with that problem, who are trying to do the thing, have that greater understanding, if you will.
Yeah. We've got some more good questions here. Do we want to tackle the question?
Go for it. Yeah, for sure.
There's one from Jim Camp 606. What are your favorite documentation tools? Do you have a preferred syntax editor, translation toolchain, etc.? Well, I'm glad you asked that. In fact, I do. I think that I like restructured text, RST, for writing documentation because it's a very powerful language. Its semantics are all about documentation, and it takes a lot of the heavy lifting out of your hand, off your shoulders, rather. So you can do things like link to other sets of documentation in ways that don't just rely on URLs not changing. You're linking to something semantic that's semantic targets inside that other documentation. Just for example, that's very powerful. That is a way of ensuring quality. For building documentation, Sphinx is a super partner for RST, and I'm sure you probably are familiar with the readthedocs.org project, where vast numbers of software projects host their documentation. It's free, and you can give them donations and so on. And I think that's one of the most valuable services that anybody has done to the open source community. It's the people behind the Read the Docs organization. So I think that's a fantastic set of tools, all the way from your editor at your fingertips to publishing it to the world. And it's all free.
It's all free and open source and great. You've got a couple of comments here, though. What about restructured text versus Markdown, for example?
You can think of Markdown as a subset of restructured text. So if you know how to do the basics in Markdown, you know how to do the basics in restructured text. You cannot do those other things in Markdown. Or, well, you can with some extensions, but they are non-standard extensions. And if you want to do them, you still have to learn some new things anyway. So if you want that rich, valuable semantic functionality that takes weight off your shoulders, that actually starts to multiply efforts, because when I use restructured text in one project and Python and Django use it somewhere else, it's not just good for me, it's we're building up whole networks of usefulness that benefit everyone. So there's a kind of accumulative power there. I think Markdown's really great for presentation. I mean, what I mean is, styling in web articles and so on. It's great. It's why you wouldn't go to restructured text for that. It's too much work. But for documentation, you wouldn't write your code in Microsoft Word, even if Microsoft Word is and maybe an easier tool to use than something else. you would use the tool that's really suited to the needs of documentation, and I think that restructured text does that, and it's worth the extra investment, even though Markdown is more ubiquitous.
More ubiquitous for sure. The two things there, restructured text and read the docs, I think are relatively common knowledge. At least they are and have always been to me. Could you explain maybe a little bit about what Sphinx is for the people who don't know?
Yeah. Okay. So restructured text is a language like Markdown,
Yep.
and Sphinx is a documentation generating tool that uses restructured text. Actually, Sphinx can also use Markdown, but it's most powerful when you're using restructured text. So Sphinx is, you can think of it as the building engine or the publishing engine that takes your raw text files and turns them into a nice set of documentation that is then HTML documentation, or from the same input will automatically publish an ebook or a PDF.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Nice. Cool.
Nice.
Were there any other questions that have come in there, Monica?
Jim asked about decent translation tool chains for restructured text.
Yeah, Transifex is probably the one I know best. Transifex. And Jim also asked, do you have any books or resources that you find particularly relevant for writing good documentation in 2021? I would say there's the Write the Docs community, which actually came out of the Read the Docs project. There's a writethedocs.org website. There's a Slack channel. I think there are conferences and meetups. Again, that's all part of the work done by people like Eric Holscher, who's behind Read the Docs, and a tremendous service to what we do in open source communities, helping documentation stay at the forefront of people's minds, building up communities of knowledge and support there. So yes, that's where I would go.
Yeah, and their Slack is, oh my gosh, their Slack is a tremendous place. I found myself, I added that, I think, last summer, and their resources are just so helpful. Chances are you can find, I mean, we're not quite doing local meetups yet, but chances are that there's a chapter that meets near you. So when we are, but the conferences and things that they put on are fantastic. So yes, agreed. Add another Slack.
Yes.
We all have 50 zillion. I think another one that that Jim asked is there was one about pain points in documentation. Let
me find that one, see if I can, or maybe
I got it.
Nice. There we go.
What are some of that? Well, I suffer much less pain personally because I found ways to do things in ways that make me less stressed and anxious about what I'm doing. And one of the things I am bringing to Canonical and we'll be sharing with the Ubuntu community are finding ways of working that just take a bit of the unnecessary pain away. Some of the pain is necessary. If you're doing hard work is hard work. You've got to put the effort in. But nobody wants to do hard work unnecessarily, to do work that then has to be undone, for example, or to work and then find out that their work wasn't the right thing, and or have doubts about what they're doing. And the always complete, never finished web conference talk is about that subject, about that particular pain point. I don't believe that there are any kind of other universal pain points that I'm seeing. I think there are some in different places. I can assure you that Ubuntu and Canonical have got some, and that's what I'm hoping to work on. But anybody who's serious about documentation, who cares about it and is trying to make it better, is somebody who's helping to make that pain less for users and other maintainers in the ecosystem. So I think documentation contributors are some of the most valuable contributors to a community.
Agreed.
Agreed.
I think it's worth saying here that on that bombshell that one of the people in the comments here, Danny Llewellyn, has been saying that they've used restructured text and Sphinx for things like Snapcraft and stuff before. The read the docs
Very
is great.
cool.
I wanted to point out that they also said earlier that their room is never done when we were talking about cleaning rooms. Just want to let everyone know, since they put it in the chat. Their room is never done.
The question is it complete? Then it doesn't matter if it's never finished, because it never will be finished. You'll never finish your work, but as long as it's complete, good enough for now, then that's okay.
That's just entropy, Danny. Don't worry. Anyway, so we've quite run out of time, just about. Is there anything else you'd like to say to everybody listening, or to people who are listening in the future before we wrap up?
Very briefly, yeah. Well, thank you for listening and asking your questions. Don't just wait to see what changes are going to take place in the documentation, but look out for opportunities to be involved in that. I think Reese or Monica mentioned workshops that I'm doing within Canonical. They're not going to be just within Canonical. They're going to be for the community as well. And you will find invitations to come to them to build up your skills in documentations, in documentation, in different aspects of it too. And I'll be really pleased to meet community members and find out how we can help each other to contribute to documentation.
Yeah, and I think we'll also put in the notes, we've got some good threads in Discourse on ways to improve documentation. Daniele, you've been active there. So we'll put those in the notes, and those are good places to go.
Okay. Absolutely. Everything we've mentioned, all the links in chat, I'll make sure that they get put in the description afterwards. I'm just going to go and find that ways to improve documentation now. So Monica, do you want to wrap things up?
I can. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for coming. Daniele, thank you for being such a fantastic guest. And anyway, we will see you next week at our new time. So don't forget, it is 1600 UTC. And we look forward to seeing you. And don't forget to get your artwork in, because it's due a week from Friday. All right. But thank you all for being here and for your wonderful questions. And we will see you next week.
Thank you for having me. Bye.